Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be doing my makeup and talking about something I'm super passionate about, which are female serial killers. They fascinate me so much, especially female serial killers of the past. And today I'm going to be talking about my favorite. I don't idolize her or want to be her. I just think her case is very interesting because we can't know exactly what happened. So let's get into it. So for today's story, I'm going to be going based off of one of my favorite books. I'm going to be referencing this a lot, as well as my favorite show, Deadly Women. Surprise. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So for the look I'm going for is going to be a vampire look, just because Erzsébet Báthory is somewhat related to like vampire folklore. So if you're wondering what kind of makeup we're doing today, that's what we do. Okay, so now that I got a complete white base on, because we're going to do some reds, we're going to be using some reds, let's get into it. Let's start talking about Erzsébet. So Erzsébet was born August 7th, 1560, and she was born in the most powerful clans of Central Europe. So she was very wealthy. Her parents spared no expense to her education. She spoke multiple languages. Let me reference real quick, such as Greek, Latin, Hungarian, Slovak, and German. Like, she spoke a lot of different languages. Her parents really wanted her to be well educated. So she was a pretty smart lady. There were rumors, though, about Erzsébet having schizophrenia, being epileptic, like having seizures as a child. And a lot of people kind of pinpoint that on inbreeding because her parents were cousins, which at the time, wasn't that big of a deal. They tried to keep the family lineage in the bloodline. So, but what resulted from inbreeding were sometimes mental illnesses and things like that. So it was never proven, but there were rumors that she did have some mental disabilities, which, it's fine. I do too. Just don't kill people if you do. So also back in those days, they had public executions. It wasn't uncommon to see torture, which Erzsébet saw quite a bit as a young girl. There's a lot of folklore about what she saw, but I don't really want to get into that. But she was invited to see all the public executions. And back then, peasants were known as property of the nobles, which Erzsébet and her family were. They were nobles back then. So those peasants, whether it was stealing, doing something, sometimes they did nothing and they got executed or brutally mutilated. It's kind of messed up. But this was in Hungary, so this was just how it went there. People didn't really care about them because they thought they were lower of class and they just didn't have respect for them. Now, during these executions, Erzsébet giggled, kind of found amusement out of it. So she was really unbothered by all the violence that she witnessed. So not only was she insanely intelligent, but she also, violence didn't bother her whatsoever. And that plays a huge role into who she became as she grew up. Now, when Erzsébet was only 10, she was engaged to a boy who was 15, whose name, hold on, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, so let me just All right. Count Ferenc Nadasti. He was the son of another powerful Hungarian family. During their engagement, while she was living at their palace, she was learning laws and how to, pretty much run this town. And rumor has it, she had an affair with one of the servants, and her soon-to-be husband had him castrated. He castrated him. So not only did he have this man castrated, after he castrated him, he threw him into a pack of wild dogs. Now, whether this is true or not, this gave Elizabeth quite the rumor of having a pretty, how am I going to say it on here without getting demonetized? She was a promiscuous lady. So, because of that, her husband, became mad and was known for his crazy violent acts that he took out on people, which Elizabeth watched and sometimes participated in. 8th, 1574, Elizabeth, 14 at the time, married said husband. And this celebration lasted for 3 days. 3 days. Wedding celebration lasted for 3 days. And there were a lot of guests there. And at the end of the celebration, he gifted Elizabeth with this castle of her own in a little part of Hungary. And that's where she went to go live. They did not live together. That he would stay there sometimes, but that was her castle. That was all hers, which honestly, I want a castle. So it took Elizabeth and her husband about 10 years to have a child, but they did. And at the time, that was a little odd, because if they found the wife to be unable to carry, that was pretty much nice for divorce. You could get divorced because she can't get pregnant. But they ended up having a child. And they don't really talk much about the child, which probably is a good thing. But after that, shortly after they had their child, her husband left to fight in the Hungarian border. And he was gone. He would come back and forth, but in the meantime, Elizabeth was in charge of maintaining both castles. So her letters to him were polite and respectful, with only occasional flash of strong-willed personality she was keeping at bay. So he came back after what they thought the war was over, but it continued, so he had to leave and go back out in the field to fight, which left Elizabeth yet again in control of both parliaments. Went back into was a lot more brutal, a lot more bloodier, and he actually had a nickname called the Black Knight of Hungary. The Black Knight of Hungary. And this is because of his reputation of ever more inhumane cruelty, nasty ass, kind of shit in battle. But so him and Elizabeth had quite a lot in common when it came to torture and violence. They really did not care that much for human life, except their child. They did care about the child. But we don't want to bring the children into this, do we? No, don't bring the children into this. Now, Elizabeth and her husband did not see each other that often during these times, but they did have one mutual thing in common, which was torturing young servant girls. This quote straight out of the Lady Killer's book, because the way that she worded this was just fantastic. So she said, the couple witnessed and even encouraged cruelty in each other, resulting in a long-distance relationship categorized by bloody reciprocity, a little less staring longingly at the same moon, and a little bit more stabbing people at the same time. Which, just, what? What? Who married these two? Whose job was it to find these two? I mean, obviously they were a perfect match, but very deadly match. A lot of the torture that Elizabeth used on her servants was taught to her by her husband, such as rolling a piece of oiled paper, sticking it in between the servant's toes, and lighting it on fire. Now this part I find somewhat funny, because Elizabeth, y'all remember Wolverine? I mean, who doesn't know Wolverine? And his claws. Well, Elizabeth, she got a glove and, manipulated it and put a lot of, knives sticking out of it, so she can torture and scratch, all of her victims with these gloves. Just was she an X-Men? Is this really just her superpower? Since they had such a common interest in torturing, they became very close, and Elizabeth went to go live at the castle. And people say when she started living there, her personality started to change. And you might think of me oh, good, maybe she doesn't want to torture people anymore. No. They called her a wild beast in a female form. And it just got worse from there. Wondering, how on earth did they get away with this? Well, at that time, servants, or serfs as they called them, they didn't see them as important, and Elizabeth wasn't the only person doing this. She was just the only one that was doing it in such a cruel manner. There were so many servants that worked at that castle that died, that were not investigated, because the actual king of Hungary was requesting money from Elizabeth and her husband, which pretty much made them untouchable. It made them go unnoticed, all their crimes go unnoticed, because they were helping the king. Now Elizabeth would go back to her castle whenever she wanted to, perform these cruel acts on servant girls. And the priests around that town started to get, a little nosy, a little curious of what she was doing, because they had to keep burying and providing funeral services for these servant girls who apparently died of cholera. One of the pastors actually called her out after one of the services. Literally called her a murderer to her face. And what the quote says that he said to her was, "Your Grace should not have so acted, because it offends the Lord, and we will be punished if we do not complain to and criticize your Grace." Yeah. So she was called out. Another quote after he said that, he said, "In order to confirm that my words are true, we only need to exhume the body of the latest dead girl, and you will find that the marks identify in which the way the death was occurred." The Countess did not like that. She hissed at that idea. I just love picturing her hissing whenever she gets mad that someone's like calling her out for murdering people. Just, I didn't kill anyone. So the pastor pretty much is like, let's dig up these bodies. Let's see. Let me just prove you're a murderer. Luckily, her husband was able to talk the pastor down, and they didn't go through with it. But her husband couldn't cover for her forever. In fact, he passed away of an illness in 1604. And by that time, Elizabeth was 34 years old. So after her husband's passing, Elizabeth kind of lost it. Not sure what caused it. I mean, it was obvious that she did love him, so it could have been the stress. Her stress could be many things, but that pretty much sent her over the edge and quickly turned this hobby of hers into an obsession. So her and I believe it was one of her servants, Darvolia, quickly turned and became financial about torturing and killing young girls. She reaped them from towns and just like surrounding the castle. Not just anything, everywhere. Just the town surrounding the castle. So you'd like notice there were a bunch of girls. She would offer them servant positions there. They would take it because she offered good money and they needed a job. These were all very, very young girls. And the town noticed like all these girls kept going missing. The families were like, where is my daughter? Well, they don't want to know where their daughter was because Elizabeth and her friend were torturing and murdering them. Now, Elizabeth did not work alone. In fact, she created her own little squad of torturers and stuff. See, X-Men. What am I saying? Or not? It's more like Suicide Squad, I guess, but just not the right way. So she befriended these other women who also took pride in torturing young women. So along with Elizabeth and her squad, they tortured and broke down girls and just really messed them up. Now, Elizabeth wasn't completely cruel. The servants that she did hire on, she had them work as her servants, and like until they messed up. If they messed up once, and it wasn't even just like a big mess up, it was little mess ups, like if like her shoes weren't tied correctly, or the stitching was off, that's when she would go and torture them, torturing like how she normally would. But then she all of a sudden had this craving for blood, to where she would torture the victims even more so to satisfy this blood craving of hers. Servants who made sewing mistakes, for instance, were tortured with needles, sewing needles being poked into them. And this obsession with blood is one reason they call her the Blood Countess. There's a lot of skepticism of if she actually bathed in their blood or put it on her face, which a lot of people were doing back then because they thought it would make you look younger. So she would brutally torture these people, collect this blood, supposedly, and bathe in it. And her friends really got a kick out of this. Her friends loved this. They were excited to do this with her, which, I mean, if you gotta have a torture squad, better make sure they're enthusiastic as you are, I guess. Now, the torture didn't stop at needles. There were things that she did. Once, someone said she bit a chunk out of one of the serfs' faces, and it was when she herself was too sick to get out of bed. So Elizabeth was sick in bed. Her servant came up to her, and she literally just like bit a chunk out of their face. Would also stick her hands in their mouth and rip their face open. This all just sounds so surreal and made up, but this stuff actually happened. Just insane. Like, these poor girls just wanted a job and ended up dying and being tortured in the most brutal ways I can think of. So all of this torture took place in one of the dungeons in Elizabeth's castle. Now let's go back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago about the rumor of her bathing in these servants' blood. Now, that rumor all started because when a servant girl ruined some aspect of Elizabeth's toilette, Elizabeth slapped the girl so hard that peasant blood splattered across her face. Now, when Elizabeth wiped off the blood, she noticed that her skin looked younger than it had before. Perfectly smooth, with the elusive, almost translucent quality she thought she would once achieve again. Where she decided to take these secretive baths at 4 a.m. in blood. In her servant's blood. Now, this is a rumor, and we don't know if this is true. We do know she did have a bloodlust, but we're not 100% sure that she actually did bathe in blood. So these rumors are spreading around, yet no one was really doing anything about it. In fact, families would be selling their daughters to Elizabeth for money, and these daughters of theirs would be getting tortured and killed. And it just kind of grew from there. It got even worse and worse and worse as it went on. Eventually, Elizabeth got bored with the servant girls and decided to open a school for young, noble girls and women, and had a price point. So if these families wanted their children to learn from her, she would get a lot of money from that. Now, eventually, when these girls came to her school, Elizabeth did what she normally did to young girls. She tortured and killed them. Now, when the parents got suspicious, Elizabeth made up this crazy excuse saying one of the girls got jealous and killed them all. Just one of the girls in the school got jealous and killed every other girl. Now, Elizabeth wasn't convincing anyone of this. No one was believing her. And at this point, everyone in town knew exactly what was going on in that castle. And they were trying to stop it because all these girls were walking around bruised, beaten, with cuts and scars, and it was just obvious of what was going on in there. Now, at this point, nobles were like demanding the king do something about this. This is getting out of hand, and they all knew what Elizabeth was doing to their daughters. This wasn't enough for the king, though, but he did send someone to investigate and stay there. So he ordered a Palatine to begin an investigation of Countess Báthory at her castle. Now this pair is a little bit awkward because who the king sent was actually a family friend of theirs. He was close friends with Elizabeth's husband, and like he was a little bit torn, but he did know where his place was to serve the king. So he did go on with the investigation, treating Elizabeth as nicely as he could, because he promised her husband that he would take care of her and make sure nothing bad happened to her. But even though all of that, he did his duty. He interviewed all the townspeople, and even though there were no eyewitnesses, the townspeople were telling him about all the women walking around with bruises, beatings, cuts, everything. And then he saw it too. And they also mentioned that there were certain parts of the castle that were very, very heavily guarded. And they thought that was a little suspicious as well. Now, convinced that Elizabeth has committed these crimes, he was torn between the promise he made to her husband and his duty to the king. So he wrote Elizabeth's son and son-in-law, and they came to the conclusion to have this never be brought to the light of day, but instead, so they didn't want a trial, okay? They didn't want a trial, but instead they locked her in that same dungeon in her castle until the day she died. And she was meant to live and stay there. So that was the conclusion that they came to. Elizabeth never went on trial for the murders or torture that she did to these young women. Now, Elizabeth Báthory died on August 22nd, 1614, after complaining her hands were cold. And that was the last thing she did, was lay down in her bed and sing. The true number of victims that Báthory tortured and killed are still uncertain to this day. People aren't sure. It could be from 200 to 600 to 50 or 60. No one ever really knows how many. But Elizabeth was buried on holy ground, later to be exhumed from the community because the community was outraged and did not think she deserved a holy burial. So, interesting enough, I think it was in Deadly Women, one of her relatives that are alive to this day went to that town in Hungary and apologized to the people for what she had done, because a lot of the living descendants of some of the people she murdered and killed still lived in that town, and they were very upset with the whole Báthory family. So that was very nice of him to do, but it was probably long overdue. This story is just insane because, one, we don't really know what happened, and two, like, what we do know what happened, we can't even imagine, because that's stuff out of a horror movie. I would like to thank you all so much for watching my Elizabeth Báthory story, well, my take on it at least. And yes, I did reference Lady Killers, and that is by Tori Telfer, and Deadly Women. Those are the two references. So if you'd like to learn more about this and where I got my references, definitely check them out. Thank you for watching my video.